everybody. Good to see you this evening. My name is Josh. I'm one of the pastors. Tonight is something a little different. Usually someone comes up here and teaches you about something from the Bible. Well, tonight it's a little different. We've been in a journey, a 4-week series, talking about anxiety and the peace of God. And one of the challenges that we've faced with this very topic is that in 4 messages or 3 messages, we can't get to the weeds and every practical area that I know a lot of people are asking about. So tonight, we have a panel of experts from all different perspectives, different areas of expertise, that we have an opportunity to pick their brains and get some of our answers, or some of our questions, if not answered, at least it'll kind of get us in a direction. Here at CVC, we believe that all of life, mental, physical, relational, all of it is underneath God's ownership. And He guides and leads all things, so He has something to say about all things. So I'm really excited about tonight. And for all you watching online, we have this stream through Facebook Live. Welcome. And you online can contribute. Go ahead and you can ask questions through the box to the right of the screen or right of the feed, and we'll actually get those. I will be on my phone all night fielding those questions. So as you ask those from our online audience, I'll be asking them in our panel. So you can contribute those in the room we'll have a roving mic here in a little bit. You can raise your hand. Pastor Brian will come and you can ask a question. But we do ask that your question is succinct and short so that we can have enough time to answer it. So, all right, well, what I want to do, get out of the way, I want our panelists to introduce themselves and let us, so we can get to know you a little bit better.
Okay, my name's Rick Duncan, founding pastor here at Caco Valley Church, married to Mary Ann for 43 years, 3 boys, 2 grandkids, and a daughter-in-law.
Yikes. I'm Dr. Walt Broadbent. I've been coming here for 11 years. Christ invaded me 11 years ago in this building. It was a wonderful thing. I've been a psychotherapist for 51 years, and if that's, by the way, indication of craziness to be a psychologist from 51. I love the Lord, and I love what I do, and tonight my aim is to open my heart to you, and I want you to open your hearts to what we're talking about. Certainly to God, but to what we're talking about too.
My name's Dr. Mindy Strauser. I am a general pediatrician, new in my first year of practice with Akron Children's, married to Jay Strauser. We came to the Cleveland area as part of my training at Case Western and Rainbow. We're originally from the Columbus area of Ohio. And up here, as not only a medical doctor and someone who sees kids with anxiety, but also as someone who also struggles with anxiety or has struggled with anxiety and panic attacks in my own personal life.
And my name is Dean Siley. I've been a pastor on staff here since 2004. I'm a licensed clinical counselor. I'm not currently practicing because I do pastoral counseling here. I've been married to Susan since 2006, and my 4 kids are watching at home. So, hi, guys.
In their PJs, I'd imagine. All right. Well, here's the first question. We've already received some questions online, as well as in some of the cards from this morning. And I'll kick this over to Pastor Rick. It's a question on why do good things happen to bad people? Or excuse me, bad things happen to good people. I guess that's another question. Why do good things happen to you, Rick? So here's a question. Why do we have experiences of anxiety if we have tried to live a good life and do the right thing? Why is this happening to me is the question.
Okay, and I think the simple answer is we're living somewhere between Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22. In other words, we are living with the effects of the fall. And you got to be careful in your relationship with Christ that you don't turn it into kind of if I do A plus B plus C really, really well, then God is guaranteed to provide for me X, Y, Z, a great and pain-free, problem-free life. It just doesn't work that way. We're in a fallen world. And yes, Jesus Christ has come and He's provided a rescue for us by dying on the cross and rising from the dead, but we're in that already but not yet time. In other words, yes, we can experience the benefits of the death and resurrection of Jesus. The gospel life is available to us, but not fully, not completely. Heaven is coming. and then it'll all be over. But meanwhile, we still deal with the results of the fall. So I think there's a little bit of some kind of squirrely theological problem with that very question, the assumption behind the question.
Yeah.
If I do this right, God's got to give me peace.
Yeah, and so you would say some of the experiences of anxiety have roots not just in like if I sin, but just the existence of sin?
Problems that create anxiety will continue to come to all of us. The most faithful person, and of course the most faithful person ever lived was Jesus. And life didn't work well for him. And in fact, at the very end, he is praying and praying and praying and was so overcome, not with sinful anxiety, but with godly concern that he literally sweated great drops of blood. So,
yeah, okay. You know, one of the questions, probably the question we received most in our request for questions was on the topic of medication. Like, what are some thoughts on medication for anxiety and how it fits into being a follower of Christ? And then at what point in my struggle with anxiety do I start looking for medication and treatment? Let me bat that one over to Mindy.
So there is a lot that goes into the diagnosis of anxiety, the treatment of anxiety. It's multifactorial like most conditions. I think Pastor Josh did a good introduction of the concept of that this morning if you were able to listen to the sermon, but kind of related that to if you think of type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Those are medical conditions where your body doesn't have insulin. Type 1, you need insulin to live for your whole life. Type 2, maybe with diet and exercise, that might be a part of the cause, but sometimes you need medicine, sometimes you don't, sometimes it's diet and exercise. Anxiety and depression are multifactorial a lot of times. Some people have kind of what we call like a type 1 diabetes type anxiety where they may have it their whole life and struggle with it. Some people might have more type 2. That is a question that you need to talk to with your general doctor, because part of the diagnosis includes ruling out other things that could mimic anxiety, like thyroid conditions and things like that. So sometimes it is warranted to do general blood work, and that's part of a discussion you should have with your physician, and I think CVC's support, the statement on this supports that. That's part of the diagnosis criteria. And then also for the treatment, it's multifactorial. Just like type 2 diabetes, there's diet and exercise, there's psychotherapy, and also, church has resources that can help there too. But then sometimes there's a point where you've reached a threshold where you are spinning your wheels, essentially. You're not going anywhere, and to get you out of that, sometimes medication, most notably our antidepressants, are what you need to kind of get out of that hole.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Dean and Walt, you guys serve and help people on the other side of the equation, on some of their personal experiences. What are your experiences and thoughts on the question was just answered?
Is that on?
Yeah.
I've spent. My entire career, what I've sometimes needed to do is refer people for medication. I don't want to complain. There aren't enough qualified psychiatrists in town. So if you know anybody that would like to move here, the thing that is important is I like the idea of the type 1, type 2 illness. My approach has always been, and we talked about the whole scope of these sermons from the beginning. Anxiety for me is one kind of thing that I deal with. I deal a lot with addiction. I deal with all kinds of other depression, all sorts of other factors that people bring to me to talk about. Addiction is one of the ones that I deal with the most. For me, we talked about it in the meeting before the meeting. One of the things that is real essential that we kind of talk about at some point is trauma. Trauma happens to all of us. And there are some kinds of trauma that happen. You're in a flood and your house burns down. Somebody in your family you really love dies. There's all kinds of shock trauma, things that happen immediately. And then there's the kind of trauma that you have over the years. I have a client right now who she was beaten every day since she was 5. And she said, my dad believed that he shouldn't spare the rod. And I said, okay, let's talk about that. And when she did, what she told me was that her father beat her for an hour at a time. Now, I think an hour is a little more than spare the rod. I mean, that seems to me to be, that's abuse. Personally, I was abused sexually when I was a kid, and that's something that we carry with us. So the whole thing that we're talking about here is anxiety is an extremely important upper level, meaning it's something that all kinds of other inner factors bring up. And it's something people come in to see me and I'm anxious. Let's talk about that. And I find out 5 really important, critical things way down deep. We obviously could not handle talk about all those things in 4 weeks. But it's something that we as a church are really interested in doing. We want your hearts. We want you to get rid of the things that block you from finding Christ. And all of the things we're talking about tonight can do that. They can all block you from getting as close to Christ as you want. So I was going to say make a long story short, but it's too late. Sorry. My thing is I believe that there is a time when people do well to get medication. And there are people that are going to be on medication the rest of their lives. One of my best friend's wife she has anxiety and depression. She takes one little tiny small pill, and it is perfect for her. Yeah. And then she'll, after 6 or 8 months or a year, say, you know what, I'm better now, and she won't take the pill. And then she's in bed in 4 days. And then she comes down for breakfast looking swell, as you can imagine, in her bathrobe, which she lives in. And her husband my friend puts one pill on her plate and says, that's breakfast. And she'll eat the pill, and then 5 days later, she's back in her normal stuff, and she says, I guess I really need to take the pill. Yeah. That's the kind of type 1 illness that we're talking about. Yeah. But there are people who, there's something blocking them from getting what they need to get done now. They need medication, and it's okay to take it. That we say this church should not dictate whether somebody takes medication or not. That's not up to the church. We want to support you in what the medical profession says to do.
Yeah. Dina, could you?
Yeah, I love what Mindy said about sometimes you need something when you're spinning your wheels. That can be very helpful to bring you up out of the depression. Because if your body's under such stress, it's hard to even hear what another person's saying. And then on Walt and I, when we then do our counseling or when we do our talking with people, I really believe in that Proverbs 3. The Lord will make our path straight, but we got to trust in Him and lean on Him. And one of the things that becomes pretty evident when we're talking with people is I'll say to them, well, what do you want and what do you need? And the answer is, I don't know. Mm-hmm. They're unsure of what they need. They're unsure of what they want. They are blaming a lot of things. They're stressed about a lot of things, but they're unsure. So I'll say to them, hey, if you had a magic wand and you waved it, what would life look like? And they're unsure of what that would look like. So we really try to get down to what is the root of your heart? What does your heart say? And what is really troubling you? And most people have not been taught coping skills, emotions to understand how to cope with the stressors in their lives. So that's a lot of what we do. Hey, let's talk through this because God has an answer and He cares deeply for you and He will make our path straight in this conversation. Yeah.
I want to take a question from our online audience, and then after that, I'd like to take a question from our physical audience, and Pastor Brian will be roving. So if you want to raise your hand, and he'll come in and get you. So here's a question, a pastoral question from Mark online. We talked throughout the series of casting our anxieties on God. Well, Mark asked, how do you cast your cares, your anxieties on Christ? I need the practical how-to. What are you guys' thoughts?
I'll throw out a couple of ideas. I mean, I don't think it's like one way. I think there are many ways you can do that. And of course, prayer is the primary way. I think when you cast your cares on Him, in your very first sermon, we were talking about that plane incident, praying. And there's the prayer you said didn't give you the kind of relief, but God ultimately did answer that prayer over time. So prayer is one way. I think singing praise is a way to cast your anxieties on God. There's a story in 2 Chronicles chapter 20 about Jehoshaphat, the king, facing a giant army, and they worshiped God. And the anxiety level went down and the victory level went up. So I think prayer, I think worship, praise, quoting scripture or having somebody quote scripture to you, those are all kinds of ways for us to practically cast our cares on God. I don't know what you guys have to say.
When I'm stressing and anxiety, I read the Psalms and I make those Psalms my prayer. David went through it all, right? Lost a child, was in depression, life was being threatened. And so I'll read those Psalms and I'll make those my own. And one of the things that David says in Psalm 38, he says, Lord, forgive me of my iniquities. I think confessing our sins, and a lot of times I'll just confess to the Lord, Lord, I cannot handle whatever it is. I need your help.
Yeah, that's good. And we have here we go. Yeah. Hey.
Hey, do I sit down or stand up?
You know, whatever you want.
Okay. I'm Charity, last name Peyton. Hey. Haven't been here in so long. My question is, so I'm trying to articulate this in the shortest way possible. So I think like the biggest thing I do is like I believe a lie from God or a lie about God, and it becomes a distortion. So like kind of what you were describing as like God as an exchange. Like if I do this, you'll give me this, like A plus B equals C. And then when A plus B doesn't equal C, I'm really confused. But I think in addition to that, like the biggest trouble I have at this time is more like I trust God, and I've realized that if I knew God more, then I'd understand his love more. And if I understood his love more, then I would trust him more. And so I guess like where I have the hardest issue is like synthesizing, okay, I have this verse I watched your preach, Josh, about 1 Peter 5, casting your cares unto God. But I don't want to like keep saying the scripture over and over, because then I get in this spiral where I'm like, why isn't this verse working?
Yeah, right.
So then I ask the Holy Spirit to come and feel the parts of me that are anxious, that are having a hard time trusting him. And then I tell him what my burden is, because that's why I'm not trusting him. But I guess my question is like, I just like want to trust him deeper so that I'm not like having to do this as
Get
often.
into that, right.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So that's a great question,
Because I got
Charity.
a good tool,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
like if I don't have to keep banging my hammer to fix the chair, like I would
Yeah,
prefer
right.
that, you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this is something, you know, we talked about last week how following the path of peace is something that happens both body and soul. So I think any of our panelists, what patterns, practices, mindsets, structures of your day can we incorporate in order to remind us of who God is, even if our emotions are pulling us one way or the other, to keep us from a cycle of feeling like, God, why aren't you coming through? And then you came through, but then why aren't you coming through again? So let's do that over.
One of the things that I think is most important, and it didn't come out, and that is that we humans are not very good at knowing what our emotions are we? Like right now, what are you feeling? When I ask that question, usually I get a deer in the headlights, like people don't know what they're feeling, and because nobody taught us. My parents taught me that the best thing that I should do with my feelings was shut up about them. And I did. I was really good at that. Now, why is that important? I think that we have a kind of limited vocabulary, almost a basic color wheel of feeling. What we have is an enormous number of defenses, and what you're describing is a lot of the time when I'm in some fix and I think, I'm feeling, actually what I'm doing is I'm expressing some deep defense. In fact, my belief is anxiety is a defense rather than an emotion. I can be heartsick, mad, hurt, scared, especially fear. Fear causes me to be anxious. So what I have to do for myself and what I help the people I work with do, what's below what it is that you're bringing to me? And very often it's their basic feelings. Feelings are interesting because if I express my feelings, true, authentic feelings, they go away. 10 minutes. But if I hold them, I morph them. So I might turn my fear into terror. I might turn my anger into hostility or bitterness or resentment. And then we're dealing with a whole kit and caboodle of what people bring to Rick, well, the three pastors on the panel, when we talk about that. So my thing is, what am I really doing? What am I really feeling underneath the defense that I create?
Yeah, that's good. Anyone else on the panel?
I would just encourage you, too, that your salvation was a free gift that you didn't need to work for. You didn't need to earn it. God gave that to you. So sometimes we work so hard where we need to let God do that work in us. And sometimes it's just being patient with the Lord as he works it on us. But remember that your salvation was a free gift that you didn't need to work for. He gave it to you freely.
Yeah.
And I think there might be a time to just say, thank you, God, that I'm experiencing this anxiety right now, because I know that you've got everything, and someday I won't experience it. So this is a gift that's drawing me to you, and so use it in some way to bless somebody else.
Absolutely. And that ties into a question we got from Nicole online, who says that I see that a lot of my anxiety is rooted in the idol of perfectionism. Can you speak on what may be the root of perfectionism and how it can be linked to anxiety, and then some practical tips? I want to ask Mindy and Rick to answer this, because these are our type A, hard driving, type 3 on the Enneagram, former professional athlete.
Are you saying we're sick? You're saying we're sick people? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying it's good to have you guys on the team. So how are you guys kind of perfectionistic tendencies, which actually, like, if I got a doctor, I want that person to be perfect, right? If I got a third baseman or center field, what'd you play? All over. I want them to be perfect, right? So maybe, what's the connection between perfectionism and anxiety?
So I know, to succeed to where I've gotten today, perfectionism got me a lot of success in terms of worldly terms, and that really kind of helped to drive me, honestly, to panic attacks. And there was I could tell more about my individual story, but that will take more time. So, but, in that season, I was starting med school and just gripped with panic attacks. And at that point, I think I was saved, but I don't think I really understood. I think going through the membership classes here at CVC, they're talking about the taproot. So the taproot is where, the initial tree drives down into the ground so that it can really make that root system deep. I didn't have that yet. And I think that comes from relying and reading the word and being in community with people that are more mature believers than you. And that at that point, when I started to do those kind of things, I had to take a year off of medical school and come back and restart when I was in a better place. And I think having those biblical truths was the start of being able to put that perfectionism in place. Yes, there's times where that drive to be, just right and just so is good, but there's perspective of, this is not what ultimately matters. This is not, as much as I think that this board exam is just gonna make or break my entire career, that's not what matters. When I took my board exam last October, I knew when I left, you know what, even if I fail this thing, that doesn't change my salvation. Jesus died for me, and I am guaranteed an eternity with him. And so, even if I fail this, I'm not a failure. And so I think having that deep taproot of knowledge is super helpful, and it continues to grow with me, and I think helps battle my perfectionism.
Yeah, and I can totally relate to that. I mean, I am a former professional baseball player, wanted to make it to the major leagues. I didn't have what it took to make it to the major leagues, and went into the ministry, and there was this question inside me: do you really have what it takes to excel? And I brought that with me into planting a church, into being a pastor. And I can remember one time when we had a service where we celebrated the buying of this property. I went backstage at Brecksville High School and just wept, because I'm going, I think maybe we've made it. But that feeling of, am I good enough, it just never has gone away. And what helps me is preaching the gospel to myself. We say beloved child over there. You are a beloved child. No matter how well you do, how bad you do, you are loved with an infinite, eternal, unchangeable, high, wide, deep, long love of God. Ephesians chapter 3. And that truth, I just keep telling myself over and over. And it's okay to mess up. Jesus still loves you. The world doesn't end. You're still going to heaven.
Yeah.
I actually had so I did do counseling throughout school, and I really struggled with kind of like perfectionism in my emails. And she's like, send an email out with a typo. And I was like, oh, I can't do that. And she's like, do it. Like, what's going to happen? So you misspelled something or didn't use proper grammar. Oh my goodness. So, do those things. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to go back to something, Walt, you mentioned, and then we've got a question from Eileen online about trauma and the experience of trauma and how that connects with the expression of anxiety. And, many of us know if we've had meaningful conversations with people, and then especially pastors who come people who come into our office and tell us their story. It's a rare case that someone doesn't have deep kind of heart-wrenching trauma. So could we maybe just talk about that a little bit? What's the relationship? Say someone, I was abused, or I had this happen to me, even a loss of job, loss of relationship, whatever the case is. what do I do with it now?
Nice, easy question.
Yeah.
What I know, there's a guy named Bessel van der Kolk. He's Dutch, I think. He wrote an amazing book. I always forget the title. The Body Keeps Score. Thank you very much. Body Keeps Score. There, we have a fan over there, somebody who reads. It's amazing. What he talked about in that book is, in fact, the idea of trauma, and he's been studying it for 30 years. Trauma, as I talked about before, comes in two kinds. One is it's shock trauma. I had a client once who described being in an auto accident. Here's what it was. She was in her car, and it was icy, and she went up over a hill and hit the curb, went up over the curb and smashed the entire passenger side of her car in with a tree. And at the end of it, she went back out on the road. She crossed the road, and then she smashed the passenger side and a tree on that side. And then she spun out and landed back in the middle of the street. So she's sitting there thinking, am I dead? But am I okay? She had a cut on her head. And she looked out the window, and there was a dump truck with salt coming at her. And she sat there, and she could do nothing. And that dump truck hit her, and she was in the hospital for 3 months. Now, that one incident caused all kinds of trauma for her. She had physical trauma. She had back surgery and all kinds of broken bones, and she was in a concussion, serious concussion. So that one incident caused real serious trauma to physically, emotionally. And the question that came out, why me? Why did I not die? That was number one. Number two, why did I get in this thing that I'm a good person, like God grades on a curve? She figured that she was good enough, and why did that happen to her? So that's one kind of trauma. And the other kind is this van der Kolk, I like saying his name a lot. Van der Kolk believed that there is a thing that he talks about with trauma, and he called it traumatic developmental disorder. That is, stuff happens to us and it keeps happening over and over again. Like in my case, my dad believed that spare the rod was a good idea, except he didn't do it. So I got beaten up a lot. As I said, I was molested when I was a kid. So I had those kinds of things. Now, trauma does not have to be something horrible like that in the sense of I can remember when this happened. I've had people who come in and say, nothing bad ever happened to me. Now, did anybody in this room say nothing bad ever happened to me? I mean, bad stuff happens to us. And how individually that bad stuff happens to us, how we react with it is absolutely individual. Some people are, and I'm one of them, really fragile. I have ADD, so there's too many people in this room as far as I'm concerned. There's too much energy.
His wife is laughing the laugh right there.
So that's my personal thing that I have to deal with. I also have fibromyalgia, which means I'm in pain all the time. Those two things contribute to what happened to my experiences as a kid, which affected me in my own treatment. I've been, 6 therapists in my career. I think a therapist who doesn't have a therapist is an idiot. Therapists need to get therapy ourselves. I've had to learn detachment, and that's something all of us can speak to. We get hooked into people. I went back into therapy recently. I began to care more about my clients' recovery than they did. Now, we're going to maybe have a question about that later. Any of you who have trauma in your life or anxiety, and you have somebody in your life that you really care about, if you find yourself caring more about them getting better, and you care more about them doing what they need to do than they do, you may have a problem of your own. Yeah. And you need to get the treatment and the support, even if the person you love doesn't get that. Al-Anon talks about that all the time, for instance. We need to take care of ourselves. And sometimes we feel selfish. And I'm afraid sometimes the church historically has made us feel selfish when we care about somebody else. And we should care about other people. We're told to all the way along. But if I care about my wife, for instance, more than I'm capable of caring about myself at the same time, I'll hurt both of us.
Yeah, that's good.
Go ahead, Dean.
I was just going to share the same type of example. I was down by the cornfields on the towpath, and there was a young man having a panic attack, and I stopped, and I asked him, what's going on? You okay, young guy? And during the fall, they shoot off the cannons in the fields to keep the birds away. And he goes, I just got home from Iraq, and I can't handle this. That's called post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's a serious issue. And a lot of people, and he wasn't even expecting that to happen. A lot of people coming back from war will say, hey, I was so focused there. I was so detached from reality. And now I'm coming home walking on these streets where people are mowing their lawns and getting their mail. And I hear these things and I see these things and I can't deal with them anymore. And then one of these, a man that I'm currently talking with, talks about his dad who came home from the war. And in their home, you didn't talk about issues. And dad either just beat them up or beat mom up. And so now he's a tender man. He's never hurt anybody. He's never done anything like that. But he's had so many failed relationships at this point because he doesn't know how to be in relationship with anybody. He doesn't know how to share. He goes from being tender to really angry. And so we're starting to talk about this trauma he experienced, and he just goes, you know what? I never thought it, and usually what people say is, but I love my dad. I've said, okay, we're not saying that you don't love your dad, but what your dad did wasn't okay. And it's caused you not to be able to be in healthy relationships because you don't know how to talk and work through things. You just go to anger. And Walt and I talked about this last. We wish in the DSM-5 there was a diagnosis for trauma. The closest we can get to that is PTSD, and which is a serious thing to go through.
And I would say very quickly that having a safe place to tell your story of trauma is huge. It says in Hebrews chapter 10, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together as is the habit of some, but encourage one another all the more as you see the day drawing near. The idea of gathering together in a small group of people that are safe people. So we need to be a safe church where people can talk about their trauma experiences and how that's showing up in their lives in weird ways. So, we need to start sharing our stories, and I think that's one way to cast your cares on the Lord, because the Lord has given us the body of Christ, and we need to tell those stories to one another.
Yeah, that's good. Let's grab a question. Pastor Brian's got the mic here.
Hi.
How you doing?
So I am an overthinker, more analytical, based on logic and natural law. And as everyone would know, when it comes to God, it's blind trust. And it's one of those things where at night when you're just kind of laying in your bed doing nothing, just kind of thinking. So what is the end, and how can I not overthink something that I have full contempt with on having blind trust?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, how do I have confidence in and be able to experience the good things based on blind trust? Now, that's an excellent question. So thank you for sharing that. I wonder if one of us can address the Christian faith. Is it a faith based on blind trust, or is the faith of the Bible something different? What do you guys think?
I think you have an answer for that. Why don't you go ahead and answer?
Well, since you ask.
I think the first thing I think about, Josh, in that is that, the Bible says that we do work out our salvation in fear and trembling. Yeah. Like there's a process that we're working these things out, and it can be difficult at times, and maybe even God feels silent at times. So if I understand your question correctly, you're saying you overthink things sometimes while laying on your bed. Is that kind of what you were saying? And it's hard to know how to let those go. And you know what? You're not alone in that area. There's been many times that I've had those issues, and many people that I talk to that they can't shut the mind off. Right? The mind just keeps running and running and running, and it can be very frustrating and cause a lot of anxiety. And I think the best way to do that is doing what you're doing now, is letting other people know those things. Get with a counselor, get in a community group where other people can know and tell you the truth about those thoughts. And don't forget, we are in a spiritual battle. Ephesians 6 says we don't fight against flesh and blood, but the evil and principalities of the darkness of this world. And I do think at times that is what we're wrestling with. And being in community and letting other people speak into our lives, what is true, what is good, is helpful. But you're not alone in those thought patterns, and they can be frustrating.
Yeah. And I will add that, the Christian faith it's a faith. It is faith. The definition of faith is a deep, enduring trust. But one of the beautiful, wonderful things about Christianity is that our trust is not in some reality that's merely outside ourselves, but our trust is in a historical fact. 2,000 years ago, a man rose from the grave. And our trust is based on not merely that historical fact, but that was God's Son who paid for our sin through that work. So the 2 billion people that worship Jesus are saying, I trust in not merely that fact, but that God did something through his Son in that for me. So some of the counselors on the panel would agree that one of the best things someone can do in areas, whether that's mental illness or whether that's in your faith and trust in who God is gather together with other believers to sing about who God is, to experience and hear about the teaching of what God has revealed to us, to serve the world in God's name, and to practice all that together at the same time saying, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. That's, if I was the writer of the New Testament, I'd be like, look, that story's not making it in the New Testament. No, that guy doesn't have enough faith. But that was purposeful. Say, look, this is going to be your reality. I believe, but help my unbelief. So my encouragement, too, is get involved with one of our life groups, with our young adult ministry, with an avenue to serve. And that often is the spark that can begin to change patterns in our lives that cause us great fear and anxiety. But I appreciate that question.
Can I add something? Our church should not set up treatment groups. It's not while we're here. We don't mean to do that. But we have a lot of people in our church that are skillful. There are people sitting in this audience who have had heart issues. I don't mean physical heart issues. I mean heart issues like they got sober, or they've been depressed for a long time and now they're not. They've worked through it and they did it with God and with earthly kinds of means. Those people need to share what they've got with others. Sometimes they have a way to do that, and sometimes not. What Dean and I have been thinking about, and Rick too, have been looking at, and Josh, and some of the others, we've been trying to figure out a way to give some training to those people, not so they can create treatment groups, that's very specialized, but that we can have people get together for support. I'm going to be doing 2 seminars in December, and I'm going to try to carry the stuff we were talking about tonight into those groups, so you can look it up. I've forgotten the dates. I have this disease.
It's actually in your worship guide. You can actually sign up for Dr. Walt's class. Just click the box and check the box.
I have this old man's disease. I can't remember anything. I forget the name of it. Anyway, I think that's really important. We live in a culture that is not interested in feeling, is it? So it's very difficult to express feelings. If we express thoughts, I'm like you. What happens with me is that I corkscrew myself, and then suddenly I'm in the ground up to my neck, and how did I get here? Because I've thought my way into this box that I can't get out of. Yeah. When I feel, and bed's a good place to do that, when I feel I'm freer and I can get some purchase on the ground. Yeah. And that's what I think we're doing, and that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. For time's sake, I want to, there's a couple questions that we've received online based on social media use and it's connected with anxiety, as well as how do we help other people who are dealing with anxiety. Maybe that's not my thing, but it's a spouse, it's a friend, it's a sister. So, Mindy, I know as a pediatrician, I imagine you or you're on the front lines of some of this, especially with people who are young. So what are your thoughts on the use of social media? Its connection to anxiety. There's a lot of great things that can happen on social media, but it seems like it's causing some issues. What are your thoughts?
So, I'm relatively new in my practice, but I am, I think it's starting to be an epidemic that we have. Social media is great in some avenues, but I don't think that's the way that God primarily intended our relationships to be. Social media can be great. It can connect people. You can have support groups. I think all of that is awesome. But in terms of a place of expressing concerns with your own personal mental illness, sometimes there can be a lot left out of a simple text. Emotions can't necessarily be conveyed that way. And especially in adolescence, there's not a lot of thought into I'm going to just write this because I'm feeling this right now, but not thinking of the consequences of those words that are left up for, as long as the internet's going to be here. Mm-hmm. So I think 2 things that there's a lot of not just adolescents, but probably adults as well. We're suffering from a lack of authentic relationships with people and being able to share our emotions and our faults and forgive face to face. So I think that's needed. And then 2, just being careful with, what you're interpreting social media. But there are benefits, but I think we have to be careful with the use.
Okay. Rick, what about you? you use your social media for ministry, and what are some best practices you have and you would encourage our community to use, how to use social
Well,
media?
I'm actually kind of rethinking my social media use. I'm reading a book right now called Deep Work, and the research says that if you're engaged in social media, it can detract from some of our best work. And really, all you have to do is just type in social media and depression. And you're going to find all kinds of secular articles that say that social media actually can contribute to depression, and there is a kind of an epidemic that's going on. So I think we got to be really, really careful, and I'm still using it. I haven't weaned myself totally off, but I'm trying to, because what happens is if you post something and people like it, there's a little release of serotonin in your brain, and you can get addicted to that. And it's crazy. If somebody said, hey, go stand in the middle of January in short pants and a T-shirt for like 5 hours in 25-degree weather or 15-degree weather, we would go, well, that's stupid. That's ridiculous. You're going to get frostbite. You wouldn't do that. But yet, secular sources tell us that social media is bad for us. And it's like standing in January in freezing temperature in T-shirts and shorts. And we just keep going back for more and more and more. So I think we got to really be careful about that.
That's good. Well, I'd like to do 2 more questions. And I kind of want to go down the row and maybe provide some practical steps based on these questions. So we're going to ask 2 questions. The first is, what tips or suggestions or helps would you encourage us to help people who are going through anxiety, depression, mental illness? Maybe we don't experience it, but they are. What should we do? We'll start with you, Rick, and go down the line.
I think all of us should take some time to pray and say, God, would you give me a unique approach to overcoming the particular kinds of anxiety that I experience? Because I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for us. And for some of us, it's like, I need to memorize the verses that Josh has been preaching from in chat. I need to memorize those verses. For some of us, it's like, there are some songs that really lift my spirits, and I'm going to put them on my Prime Music app or what have you, and I'm going to listen to those things. And so we all probably have, and for some of us, it may be sitting down with a cup of coffee with a friend and just pouring out our hearts. I don't know, but I think I would say go to God with an open mind and an open heart and just say, Lord, give me some tools that I can use that are unique to me so that I can overcome the anxieties that I suffer.
What are the tips for walking with someone, a close friend, family member, walking through mental illness? What would you say?
My tendency, of course, is to answer in a secular way because I know that. I mean, I've done that for a long time. I love what you said. I love the idea of we need to get with God about what does God want us to do. My personal belief, this is not endorsed by anybody but me, that is, I don't think God cares at all if we understand him. I don't think he cares. I think he just wants us to obey him and love him. And what makes me crazy is when I try to understand him and figure him out. I'll never be able to do that. Second, I think that a lot of the people that I don't see are people who are so wrapped up in themselves and so tight and so hurting, they don't reach out. They can't. And to give tips to those people, it's nice, and I'm glad we're doing it. I think it's a good question, by the way. But for me, the idea of you sitting here, you're going to see people in church that look like this. Their faces are drawn in. We need skills to be able to approach them. We don't have that in this church. I mean, I'm not knocking the church, but we don't. We don't just approach somebody and say, you look screwed up. Is that right? You know? And we shouldn't. But I mean, the idea is, as a body, what we need to do is, like Rick talked about, we need to be safe here. And there's not a way yet there's a million ways, and there's a lot of ways that we use here. But I'd like to see some organization about how to teach us how to do better at that. And then last, I think, the idea of it individually, it's real important to start plumbing my heart, to know what's going on in my heart. The more I do that, the better I feel. And the better I feel, the more I'm able to talk to people. As long as I'm isolated, I got trouble. And that's what we tend to do in this culture. I love what you said. The idea for me, I tell the people I work with, do not under any circumstances give somebody that you love a text where you have feeling in it, because they won't get it. They won't get it. You cannot transmit emotion, I don't think, on the web. I personally hate Instagram, for instance, because it looks like a bunch of ego-driven nitwits that are on. Of course, I'm on it too, but I mean, I think the idea is that we just need to be extremely careful about what we put out there, because we might get 50 likes, and then we get one person that is trolling. They're trying to find somebody that oh boy, and then they just give it to you, and then you feel lousy for a week. We got enough of that. You go to the gas station, give people your money, and they insult you. I mean, you don't need to look very far to get insulted. So be inward in that sense, and I think get as close as you can to what your feelings are, and then talk to somebody. Sit and have coffee and talk. And then come here and try to figure out some way in which to get with people that you can talk to.
Cool. Excellent. Mindy, what are any tips or suggestions in walking with someone you love through mental illness?
And just speaking as someone who walked through that, I'll kind of speak as what I would say to myself maybe 10 years ago, since the 10-year challenge is going through Facebook right now. But so the first thing I would say is finding a caring community where you can really have people that are more spiritually wise than you are and really invest in you. And really finding CVC when we moved here, when I was going through all of that, was a huge blessing and part of that. Two, being a self-feeder. So that's still something I'm growing in, and you won't really know how to differentiate your feelings of needs versus wants unless you know what the biblical truths of that are. And I think that's where a lot of us wrestle, is we get a lot of anxiety. Well, I need this, I need this, I need this. But do we? Is that biblical? Is what we're worrying about actually in God's perspective? And then three, just as a healthcare professional, if you're to that point, like where I spoke before, where you're spinning your wheels, or, as you put, like corkscrewing yourself down, and you feel there's no way out, one, if you're dealing with suicidal thoughts, reach out, whether that's going to the emergency room, there's the suicide hotline, which I think we have in different posts throughout here, or reaching out to someone that you care about. That is a place where don't wrestle with that alone. And two, if you're not to that point, but you just feel like you're spinning your wheels and I can't get out of this pit, that's maybe where you need to talk to both the counselor and your medical doctor to see if that point is where maybe we need to escalate treatment, psychotherapy, plus or minus medications.
That's good.
So the first thing I would say is, being a pastor and counselor, when I try to be that at home, it doesn't work very well. So I would say first, if you have a loved one or somebody close to you, you're not their counselor. You're their family member. You're their supporter. Be a supporter there. I think that's really important to know. And you're not somebody who is to diagnose or treat them. You're there to be a supporter. So try to get them the help they need. You have to understand, if somebody has a mental illness like bipolar or schizophrenia or even some kind of severe anxiety, they are not purposely trying to make your life miserable. They themselves are suffering through this mental illness. And a lot of times, because of their maladaptive behavior, it feels like they're doing this to you. So sometimes you need to take a step back and realize they're suffering and miserable and struggling as well. It's not personal. And then the next thing I would say, for you supporting somebody, get support yourself. Make a counseling appointment, get into community, start to talk with people, because you're going to need support. But also set healthy boundaries. You're not to be walked over, and you're not to be to just let them do whatever they want. You have to set healthy boundaries in a relationship like that to take care of yourself and to best take care of them. So those are some tips I would do. It's not easy, and you need support in the midst of that. And also I would say, read up on that issue. Understand, go to doctor's appointments. Try to really understand what they're dealing with so you can best support and love them through it.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate you guys, your expertise, your hard work in your field of study. So thank you. Can we give them a round of applause? You guys go.